Good morning, and for some of our audience, it's good afternoon. My name is Susanna Gurr, and I'm the Managing Director at the BC Centre for Employment Excellence. Welcome to today's webinar. We have close to 200 participants registered for today's webinar. I want to welcome those who are attending the Centre's webinars for the first time, and I hope you will return for more. This is a special 2-hour webinar. It is packed with information on specialized client assessments with an informative and practical focus on their use in employment services. We're delighted to have with us 3 very knowledgeable and experienced clinicians who will be sharing their expertise on different types of specialized assessments across a variety of domains and contexts, including the intent of the assessments, practical information on preparing your clients for assessment, and sharing the results of clients in order to help them participate better in the labor market. There will also be some information for conducting specialized assessments in rural areas. To illustrate the application of selected assessments in the field, we also have 2 case study presentations from 2 practitioners. As usual, we will begin with a poll. If you are attending with a group, check the answer that's most common for the group that's participating. For those of you who are not familiar with the Centre, it was created in 2012 with funding from the provincial and federal governments to act as a research and knowledge sharing organization for BC employment service providers and employers. The Centre's mandate is not only to do innovative research, but also to find ways to share best practices with BC practitioners and employers and better integrate evidence into practice. We created this webinar series as a way to reach out and connect to practitioners. Through this series, we have highlighted new research by the Centre, but are also tapping into the knowledge and expertise within the employment services community. You are invited to view the video recordings of previous webinars that we have posted on our website. Okay, the results of the poll are in. The question, how would you rate your experience with specialized assessments? Over half of the audience have referred and prepared clients for them. Not many have a lot of experience. About 20% have some experience, and 21% are aware of them but do not have much experience with them. Next, I'm delighted to introduce today's 3 clinicians who will be presenting on specialized assessments in the first part of this webinar. First, Ralph Cheeseman. Ralph is the CEO and Director of Operations at Back in Motion Functional Assessments, Inc. He is an occupational therapist by training. Ralph has spent the last 2 decades specializing in functional capacity evaluations with the purpose of assisting individuals to identify their abilities and limitations in an effort to enable them to take necessary steps towards employment goals. As a therapist, Ralph has witnessed the inspirational efforts of many individuals to overcome disability and regain their independence, inclusive of their goals to return to work. Our next clinician, Dr. Brenda Hogan. Brenda is a registered clinical psychologist and manager of psychological services at Back in Motion. Brenda completed her PhD at the University of British Columbia. She started her career in Cambridge, England, where she worked in the outpatient psychological center at Addenbrooke's Hospital, providing short-term evidence-based treatment to clients with a wide range of problems. She has been with Back in Motion since 2005, helping people with physical and mental health disabilities overcome their challenges and reach their vocational goals. We also have Dr. Andre Fillon. Andre is the Director of Headwise Rehabilitation and is a registered psychologist with the College of Psychologists in British Columbia and also the College of Alberta Psychologists. He has over 20 years of experience working with individuals with brain injuries. His area of expertise is in clinical neuropsychology and rehabilitation, specifically in the assessment and rehabilitation of people with head injuries and other neurocognitive challenges. Dr. Fillion completed his doctorate in psychology at the University of Johannesburg, formerly known as Rand Afrikaans University. In addition to his work at Headwise Rehabilitation, Dr. Fillion is a consulting forensic neuropsychologist of BC Mental Health and Addiction Services Forensic Psychiatric Services. He is also an adjunct faculty member at SFU and UBC. There are two parts to today's webinar. The first part is with our three clinicians and will last 75 minutes, but with 3 small breaks for Q&As. It will be followed by 2 case studies, which will last 20 minutes in total. This will be followed by a final discussion session. You have great resources here, and we really encourage you at any time during the presentation to use the questions feature on your dashboard to submit any questions or comments you may have, which will be facilitated by my colleague Greg during the discussion periods. I know all the presenters welcome the opportunity to engage in discussions with you. And now it's my pleasure to hand the microphone over to our first presenter, Dr. Brenda Hogan.
Thank you. We are very pleased to be able to participate in this mini symposium on specialized assessments for employment services. As many of you know, these assessments can be invaluable for employment planning for clients with psychological and physical barriers to employment, helping clients move towards successful and hopefully sustainable vocational functioning. Okay, so our presentation today will be divided into 2 broad sections. First of all, we will review what kinds of specialized assessments are available for clients involved in employment services. I think it's important to note that this won't be an exhaustive list. We will talk about the specialized assessments that are offered through our respective services, and thus we are the most familiar with. But I think it's fair to say that this should be a pretty reasonable representation of what should be available throughout the province. We will then move on to talk about strategies to maximize the benefit of a specialized assessment. We will try to take you through the entire process, starting with making the referral and preparing the client, all the way through to the report, recommendations, and the feedback session. And we will make sure to take time for questions throughout. Okay, so I will start by talking about the assessments that are offered through Compass Assessment Services at Back in Motion. We offer a variety of specialized assessments, all of which are performed by psychologists. We primarily offer these assessments through the Lower Mainland of British Columbia and the Fraser Valley, but over the last 12 months or so, we have offered these assessments to employment service centres throughout the province, focusing on geographical areas that have traditionally had difficulty accessing professionals to provide these kinds of assessments. So we've traveled to places like Fort St. John, Dawson Creek, Fort Nelson, and we're currently planning a trip to Port Hardy. So hopefully this is increasing the accessibility of these assessments to some of these places. Okay, so I'll get started. The first assessment that I will talk about is the Vocational Psychological Assessment. This is also sometimes referred to as a psychovoc assessment or a psychovocational assessment. It is by far the most common specialized assessment that we offer. It is appropriate for several different client groups. Clients with well-documented mental health challenges are often referred for this kind of assessment, but clients with mental health challenges that are not well documented, but rather suspected or seem apparent, but have not been formally assessed or documented. There's not a lot known about exactly what's going on, even though it might be quite obvious to the people that are working with this client. These are also frequently referred for this kind of assessment. Other clients who are often referred are those that seem to be having significant challenges with functioning. So this may be obvious, again, to the people that they're working with, and it may be difficulties functioning in their day-to-day life with basic things like self-care, or it may be with skills like showing up on time for meetings or being reliable in their performance in the Employment Service Centre. And the reasons for this may be, or maybe not, well understood. Another client group that is well served by this kind of assessment are those with intellectual or learning challenges. Again, these may be well understood, so there may be a diagnosis that's on file already, or they may be suspected problems that require clarification. So the vocational psychological assessment essentially involves two parts. So the psychologist starts with a clinical interview, and it's through this process that the psychologist explores the client's psychological symptoms and functioning, the history of their challenges, psychosocial challenges that the client may be facing, what kinds of supports, if any, the client has in place, as well as a detailed exploration of the client's educational and vocational history. Through this process, the psychologist is looking to both identify the barriers and challenges the client is facing, as well as identify the strengths and skills that the client has that can be tapped in the vocational planning process. So after the assessment is completed, the report is prepared. The report summarizes all of the information that was collected during the assessment, the results of the testing. It provides conclusions and identifies the barriers that the client is facing, as well, of course, as the strengths. The part of the report that is often the most interesting to the employment professionals and sometimes to the clients as well are the recommendations. So here we're talking about what kinds of suggestions we are making to help move the client forward. So in our reports, we divide the recommendations into two sections. So first of all, what we do is make recommendations to address the barriers to training and employment. And the second part of the recommendations are specific job and training programs that would be appropriate. Okay, so I'll move on to the next assessment, which is called the Vocational Psychological Profile Assessment. And essentially, this is a brief, quick and dirty version of the Vocational Psychological Assessment. So the report is shorter, definitely, but it does include the same kind of specific individualized recommendations to support employment success. Now we get a lot of questions about who would you refer for the vocational psychological assessment versus the profile assessment. So generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that a client who presents with fairly complex or multiple problems is not going to be best served by the profile assessment. So the standard assessment would be better for them. It is just going to allow a much more comprehensive examination about what's going on. But clients with straightforward mental health problems, a single mental health problem, or recent challenges would be better served by this kind of assessment. I think another really good example of when the profile assessment is a good choice is when there has been a vocational psychological or a psychovoc assessment done previously. So sometimes we get referrals for this assessment where the employment professional or case manager has a copy of the previous assessment, but it maybe dates back 8 or 9 years. And what they really need is an update on how the client is doing now, with recommendations that are up to date with the client's current functioning. So that's another really example of a really good use of this particular assessment. We also offer the Vocational Psychological Learning Disorder Assessment. It is essentially a standard vocational psychological assessment with additional assessment and testing for a specific learning disorder included in the process. Now, I think it's probably a good idea to pause here for a moment and talk a little bit about what exactly a learning disorder is, as this is quite a confusing term for many people. Often the term learning disorder is confused with intellectual disability, so I'll just take a moment to explain the difference. An intellectual disability is diagnosed when a client has significant deficits in intellectual or cognitive, as it's sometimes called, functioning. So their intellectual functioning across the board is in the very low range. So this needs to be combined with significant deficits in adaptive functioning across various domains in their life. So what we would be looking for is the client having difficulty with functioning in different areas of their life. So practical, social, work, academic, and so on. And if they meet that kind of criteria, it's an intellectual disability. A specific learning disability, on the other hand, is diagnosed when a client has a very specific and significant difficulty with an academic area. So it can be reading, writing, or math, or any combination of those three, but the difficulty cannot be explained by deficits in intellectual functioning. So in essence, they would have normal intellectual functioning, but have a very specific learning challenge. Another point that's important, I think, to make is that the learning problem cannot be explained by other factors, such as factors that interfered with their learning opportunities. So for example, if we saw a client and they did present with significant learning problems in an academic area, but when we look at their history, we see that they had a very tumultuous childhood and adolescence. They had lots of psychosocial problems while they were growing up. They're maybe changed schools upwards of 10, 11 times. There were lots of problems with truancy. We probably would not diagnose a learning disorder in a case like that. And the reason would be is that the academic problems that they were having would probably be better explained by the lack of educational opportunity. Okay, so coming back to the assessment, basically here what we're looking at is identifying whether somebody has a learning disorder. And this is obviously an important question depending on the nature of job that's under consideration, but also if training is an option. So we would want to be providing accommodations if that's appropriate, and also selecting jobs and work environments that are appropriate for the challenges that these people would face. We also offer the Vocational Psychological Assessment in combination with an assessment for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or ADHD as it's often called. Again, this is a traditional or a standard vocational psychological assessment with the add-on assessment of Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, the reason why we have this assessment is twofold. One, the symptoms of ADHD can quite significantly negatively impact the skills needed for many kinds of occupations. So the ability to attend, concentrate, focus in busy, fast-paced environments, for example. ADHD can also cause significant challenges in training environments, but these can often be at least partially ameliorated with appropriate accommodations. Now, the other issue is that ADHD is actually a very complex diagnosis to make. It requires objective testing beyond just interviewing the client and asking about symptoms. And it also requires the psychologist to collect collateral information, usually from a parent or somebody who knows the client very well, and often collection of school records as well. Now, I'll just very quickly talk about this assessment. This is, again, an assessment that's combined with the Vocational Psychological Assessment and involves assessment of both learning disorder and ADHD. And the reason why this assessment was designed and existed is because learning disorder and ADHD often co-occur. So they're often happening in the same individual. And other times the question is, is it one or the other? So what exactly is the problem, or is it both? All of these reports, of course, include recommendations in the same format I discussed earlier. We also have a straight learning disorder assessment. Now, we added this assessment because what we realized is that certainly there are clients who are involved in employment services where this is the only question. Does the client have a learning disorder? And usually this question comes up if training is under consideration because individuals are eligible for accommodations in training settings if they have a specific learning disorder diagnosis. Now, the challenge is that many people will have received this diagnosis while they were in school, especially if they went to school in the last decade or two. But if they do not have a confirmation of this diagnosis within the last 5 years, they will not be eligible for the accommodations in school. So this assessment is designed to reassess them for a learning disorder, provide the diagnosis if appropriate, and then provide recommendations for the accommodations in the training program. So technically this isn't really a vocational assessment. This is just a learning disorder assessment. The last assessment that I will talk about today is what we call an employment planning assessment. So this assessment in other contexts is just called a vocational assessment. We called it a different name to just help differentiate it a little bit from the vocational psychological assessment. So this assessment is appropriate for clients with no identified psychological barrier, but there are questions about suitable employment. So to help you understand who would be suitable for this kind of assessment, I think maybe an example would be helpful. A client that was recently referred to our service that I thought was a good candidate for this kind of assessment was somebody who worked as a laborer for many years, had dropped out of high school at grade 10, and had moved right into the working world as a construction laborer, and had worked there for decades. But then when he was in his 50s, suffered an injury and was no longer able to work in a job that had physical requirements. So he had very few transferable skills because of that, and there were a lot of questions about whether he would be a suitable candidate for retraining. There was very little known about his academic skills. Not only had he dropped out of school early, but his jobs that he'd had over the years had not really required a lot of reading, writing, or math. So he was referred for this assessment, and what it did was help identify sort of where his cognitive abilities lie, what his strengths and weaknesses were, his level of academic skills, so questions about whether he would be a suitable candidate for training or whether upgrading would be required could be answered. But then also importantly, looking at what his vocational likes and dislikes were. What kinds of job tasks would he likely enjoy or not enjoy, as the case may be. And this allowed us to come up with a list of recommendations for employment planning for this individual. Okay, so I will pass it over now to Andre.
Thanks very much, Brenda. So a little bit of technical difficulties there, but moving on to the next section of our presentation, and this is the assessments that Headwise provides. And our service really focuses primarily on neuropsychological assessments. So the first type of assessment that we offer is the neuropsychological vocational assessment. And these assessments are really very similar in terms of content and structure to the assessments that Brenda has already spoken about. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that because I'd like to focus more on the kinds of clients for whom this type of assessment is really appropriate. Because I am aware from previous discussions with many different employment professionals that this can be a very difficult decision to make in terms of determining whether a client is better suited to a psychological vocational assessment as compared to a neuropsychological vocational assessment. And the primary reason why one would want to do a neuropsychological assessment is when we're dealing with clients whose main barriers to employment relate to their ability to apply their neuropsychological or otherwise their thinking kind of processes. And usually this is because there's some kind of an acquired brain dysfunction. So something has happened somewhere along the way that has affected a client's ability to be able to use the brain functions that we're all very familiar with, comfortable with, and rely on without even thinking about. So examples of some types of conditions or some clients for whom this might be an appropriate kind of a situation or a referral includes obviously clients who have traumatic brain injuries. This would be the one that most of us are familiar with. Other types of acquired brain injury that I think are also fairly commonly kind of identified as being likely causes of brain dysfunction would be things like strokes, people who've had aneurysms that have ruptured, people who have brain tumors, those kinds of conditions. Some infectious diseases like try to think of the word now, people who've had any kind of infection that affect their brain functioning, often these are childhood diseases, things that have affected their ability to cope, would be, what is the word I'm looking for? Encephalitis. Also people who have word-finding difficulties. Yeah, a potential option. So people with encephalitis, again, these are conditions that people recover from fully, and later on we would think that they have recovered and there's no reason to be concerned about their functioning. Then other kinds of conditions that are perhaps less obvious as causes for brain dysfunction might also be important to think about. And these are things like multiple sclerosis, for example. Often the main complaints or concerns that people have relate to tiredness, difficulties with tolerance of activities, and yet for some people this also affects cognitive functioning, particularly in terms of things like how quickly they can process information or how much people can cope with complex activities. Another one that's easily missed is cerebral palsy, for example. Again, often the main disabilities people have coped with have been physical in nature, related to motor functioning, or balance and mobility. And yet, because of the reasons why these kinds of conditions exist, this typically relates to some degree of oxygen starvation at the time of birth, and for that reason, other functions that are also affected may be cognitive functions, including subtle attentional problems, subtle difficulties with being able to deal with complex reasoning and interpersonal kinds of situations. Another one that's very similar are things like fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Again, not necessarily recognized as something that may purely affect cognitive functioning because of the other factors that are often very prominent, like behavioral issues and attentional issues. Brenda also mentioned the potential confusion with learning disorders, because very often people with intellectual disorders are simply labeled, particularly by family physicians or even by the families as people are growing up, as having a learning disorder, when in fact the problem was that there was cognitive impairment during the school years that affected their school functioning. And even in these cases, any one of these diagnoses that I've touched on so far actually may be the culprit. And so it's very important to try and understand what exactly is affecting a person's brain functioning or ability to apply their brain abilities. And so when we do a neuropsychological assessment, having identified the clients who are appropriate for this type of assessment, what we look at, in addition to the different kinds of areas that Brenda has already spoken about, is the neuropsychological assessment focuses on what we call functional domains. And I think of these really as kind of the jobs that the brain has to do for each one of us. And these jobs relate to really managing information that comes at us from the world around us and from the different tasks and activities we have to do. The first one is attention, concentration, or information processing. So truly being able to respond to information that we have to deal with to solve problems, deal with tasks, or cope with everyday activities. The second has to do with communication, speech, and language, how well a person is able to make themselves understood, deal with complex communication, whether that be in reading, writing, or interpersonal sort of interactions. So in other words, the communication that is not necessarily speech related, but are non-verbal communications, like understanding emotions or being able to understand body language and respond appropriately to social cues. Perceptual motor functioning is the next one, and that has to do with being able to make sense of visual tasks, visual processes, both in terms of understanding these processes, but also being able to create perceptual motor reactions and responses, like copying pictures from a board, doing designs, working with three-dimensional tasks like assembling furniture, those kinds of things. Memory is another important one. Clearly in terms of coping with many types of jobs, but certainly also with educational settings, it is extremely important to understand how a person's memory functioning is helping them or hindering them. And then the last one is what is called executive functions, and this is a very difficult concept to really understand, because it is in many ways the most complex of the different functional domains, but it's also one of the more important ones. And we do know that people who have problems with executive function are often the ones who have the most difficulties coping with both educational settings and with dealing with employment. And when people have acquired executive function deficits, for example, after an injury, these are folks who really have a very hard time getting back into either the jobs they've done before or even into making the transition back to employment. So those are the types of areas that a neuropsychological assessment will function on. And what then happens in terms of being able to move forward with the assessment is the report that is prepared will provide a summary of the findings that are derived by assessing these different areas. And these findings will include a diagnosis where that's appropriate, and this may relate primarily to situations where a diagnosis may help a person to achieve particular kind of accommodations and perhaps access particular services. The report will also really focus very carefully on what abilities have been preserved. In other words, where there's been a change in functioning, what areas are still strengths for the person, as well as what barriers arise from the acquired problems that a person now has and how these affect functioning in everyday life. And of course, this will proceed to very specific recommendations, bearing in mind or taking into consideration these different areas of difficulty and specific recommendations in terms of how to accommodate for these, potential treatment options or compensatory strategies that may help a person cope with everyday activities. So that's by far the most common assessment that we do, because it is comprehensive and allows consideration of all of these different areas. There are two other types of assessment that we also do offer. One is a neuropsychological vocational assessment with the option of also looking at attention deficit hyperactivity disorder for all the reasons Brenda has already mentioned, and that is that this may be an additional barrier over and above the kinds of problems that a client may be dealing with already. We also offer a shorter neurocognitive screening assessment. Again, this is a reduced scope of assessment. The report is much more succinct and is less appropriate for clients who are more complex. And an example of where this would be a good option is where somebody had a previous assessment, a vocational psychological assessment or a learning disorders assessment in the last few years, and now seems to be having more difficulties than might have been anticipated, or may have had an event that has happened in the interim that may have changed their level of functioning. And I think that hands me over to
unexpectedly. All right, thanks, Andre. The West Coast here, I'm looking at time here, and we've broken through the morning barrier, so good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure to speak to an audience about the features of functional assessment. Certainly something that I and my colleagues are passionate for. I can speak for my colleagues and say that people with or individuals we see with employment services are always interesting, and certain of them are very inspirational. So we love to assess this client group. First of all, functional capacity assessment. We definitely want to turn this functional rather than physical. You'll see, and a lot of people, I think, from what I saw on the poll, that most of you probably have some experience reading functional reports before. And a lot of people think about it as a physical capacity assessment, and there are a lot of physical parameters that are measured in these things, things such as strength and body mobility and postural tolerance, things that we think of as physical attributes. But you need to take into consideration that it's still in a functional context. And as an occupational therapist, we definitely look at function as a biopsychosocial process. And so when we're assessing individuals, we're looking at their cognitive and their social functioning as well as their physical functioning. Typically when we do an FCE, or a functional capacity evaluation, it is a full day endeavor. If you're looking at your service provider, wherever they are in the province or the country, you want to make sure that you're seeing an evaluation that's lasting 7 or 8 hours. That's an important feature because this type of evaluation is wanting to look at tolerances. The clinician is going to need quite a bit of time with an individual to go through their certain circumstances and then spend time to properly measure all of these different types of functional parameters. It's a systematic process, it's objective, and you're going to get a report that has a lot of detail in it. You should always be looking that there's a good summary section in a report, because you probably won't necessarily understand or know all the details that you read, but the summary should be able to illuminate how that client's done. We also offer a 2-day assessment. It's something that other service providers will offer. It's certainly something you should consider. A 2-day assessment is helpful in that it answers one main question, which is, how do we know that the person is going to be able to reliably produce the function they did on day 1? We see a lot of different people with different conditions. Some are going to have waxing and waning issues for those clients, and we're always left wondering, can they do this day in, day out? Because that's what the work environment is going to require. So if you have an individual, it'll be one of your questions you want to ask yourself before you even decide how many days you want them assessed. Is there a situation, one, that you feel is a capacity issue and likely could be answered in just a 1-day assessment, or is it more one of a tolerance issue and might need more than 1 day of assessment? In terms of types of clients that we see are typically involved in functional capacity evaluation, usually there's somebody with a former work history. And the reason I tell you that is I'll differentiate that from a population of people that might be useful to be assessed with a different vehicle in a minute, which is the work simulation assessment. Typically individuals have worked, and so they have what we would call vocational feasibility. They have the normal parameters for the most part that we expect people with work to have. They're going to show up reliably, they're going to behave relatively well, they're going to be able to manage instructions and perform to ability that you would expect is not remedial. So that's a first important thing to consider. Typically, these people have had a change in their situation. They may have changed their jobs for an impairment. An impairment could be something like a rotator cuff injury. They were a construction worker, something that Brenda talked about, and they no longer can do that level of physical work. And so now they've come to you looking for options. Other times it could be an associated disability with a systemic disease, something like fibromyalgia, could be something like multiple sclerosis, as Andres talked about, where there can be a relapse and remitting process or a steady decline in function, and now what they used to be able to do is no longer viable, and they need to look for alternatives. So those are the kinds of things that we see. One of the main issues that most functional capacity evaluations are designed to address is chronic pain. We see a lot of individuals with spinal disorders. They could be degenerative in nature. Again, this is going to change their abilities to do things. It may require them to work part-time. It may require them to have job modifications or accommodations. It may require them to obviously change their job. So we're going to be looking at those types of individuals and those issues and providing goalposts for the function so that you have an understanding of what might be potential for them in an alternate job or what may no longer be appropriate for them. You should also consider individuals who have systemic disease. Again, this will often work into their ability to tolerate work and job demands, and as a result, they'll have a lot less energy. And this is where the length of time of a functional capacity evaluation is helpful for you and for the client to help them determine what is reasonable, what they're going to be successful doing. The whole purpose of this is to itemize the new next best steps for them in terms of returning to work in a successful manner and not having the awful situation of them spending a bunch of time and money retooling that and then finding out they can't be successful in a new endeavor. With these individuals, you often will see some comorbidity. They will have often a mood disorder component. They may have a neurological disorder as well. I find a lot of clients, if they're dealing or contending with a disability, particularly if it's a new one, are going to have a loss of confidence. And with that comes a lot of question marks in their mind. And often the assessment is helpful because it helps bolster a client's confidence. They do realize they're capable of certain functions, and they do have next steps to plan for. All right, so moving on to the there we go, work simulation assessment. We get a lot of questions about what is the difference between an FCE and a work sim assessment. The first one is time. It's a shorter assessment. It's usually about 3 or 4 hours. So we can only do so much during that assessment. And as such, what we typically do is target a contextual situation, which would be work simulation. This is for clients that you feel have maybe just one idea, or you really think that they might have some limits in their full spectrum of work, and you're wanting to try and find something that they will be safe and successful at, and so you'll try this out. You can think of these assessments as your test kitchen, as if you're a group of chefs and you've got a recipe, which is your client, and you don't know if the whole mix of the ingredients are going to work in one way or the other, and so you'll put them into this test kitchen to get a sense of what works and what doesn't work. We often see clients here that may not have a work history. These are individuals that have usually pretty significant comorbidities. They may not have worked as a result of that. They may have developmental disabilities, and we're really trying to carve out the best way for them to enter the workforce safely and successfully. So ideas might be things like, well, could they be a cashier? Could they handle money? These are things we can do with a client to see how they manage that. Could they be a hairstylist or work in a hair salon helping the hairstylist? Could they work in janitorial services, things like that? There might be a physical component to it, but there's often also the component of looking at, are they vocationally feasible to be in the workplace? And what I mean by that is, do they have the social attributes? Do they have the cognitive attributes to engage with employers, with other colleagues, and with the public in doing functional tasks? We might look at through that assessment in any particular work simulation, can they make decisions? Can they manage frustrations? Can they respond to change? Can they handle supervision? What is their productivity like? If they have a information processing problem as Andre might illuminate in one of his assessments, well, what does that look like in terms of functional output? So we can put these people in this test kitchen, help them determine what they're good at, and provide you as the case managers ideas about best next steps in terms of getting them back into the workforce. And lastly, we do ergonomic assessments as well. And this is usually really two main issues we're looking at. Typically the physical environment in home, school, or work settings. You may have a client who's placed in work and for whatever reason is not getting assistance from their employer, and you might find that they're challenged now by that, and you want to have a therapist come in and see if we can change some of the ergonomics to help that individual with their issue. It could be positional tolerance or pain. Typically, the number one ergonomic assessment we do is computer access issues. Computers have become so foremost in all of our work, and a lot of people with a disability will often gravitate to a computer-based type work. So we do a lot of those types of assessments. And the other one is accessibility, getting into the workplace, getting into school. Persons with mobility disabilities may need recommendations and equipment. Could be power and mobility, and the therapist can assess and help you determine what equipment is best for them. All right, so that brings us to the end of what specialized assessments we provide.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. So we had a number of questions come in during that first section of the presentation, which is great to see. We're not able to get to all of them because we have quite a bit of information to pack into the rest of the webinar. But maybe I'll just throw out a couple of the questions that came in. And of course, whoever would like to jump in, please feel free to do so. So the first question that came in, and hopefully I'm reading this correctly. Someone's asking, where do people fit who score low on adaptive function tests, such as autism and FASD, versus those who score higher on IQ but not under 70?
So I think the kind of question here really has to do with diagnosis. The people who score low on IQ tests would be those who would meet criteria for a diagnosis of an intellectual disability. People with autism spectrum disorders, people with FASD, people with acquired brain injury can also have significant problems with adaptive functioning. And so if we do a test of adaptive functioning, they may score low on the same kinds of areas where people with autism, with intellectual disability have, but it's simply that the reason for it is different, and so the diagnosis will be different. The impact of that in terms of how people function in the workplace or in educational settings or the kinds of supports they'll need probably won't be all that different.
Yeah. So for the intellectual functioning for clients with autism or FASD, it can be below 70, so that would be what would be considered very low, so an intellectual deficit, but those people can also function at a higher level as well, and that wouldn't exclude them from getting the diagnosis. So you can have autism or FASD and have very low intellectual functioning, or you can have specific areas that are low and some that are higher, or functioning that is fairly normal.
Okay, great. And let's take one question before we move on here. Someone's asking, I believe, Brenda, it was you who discussed employment planning assessments?
Yes.
How do they differ from general skills assessments, career assessments, et cetera, that are used in employment planning?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think there's overlap in the questions that those assessments are answering. Something that makes the employment planning assessment distinct is that we're measuring cognitive functioning. So we're really looking at a person's thinking ability, to put it very simply, and looking at what their strengths and weaknesses are there. And then we can map that onto jobs, so our job tasks. What kinds of job tasks would they be good at or not so good at based on their strengths and weaknesses? So it allows us a very good window into that. But in terms of career assessment, that's very similar to vocational interest testing. So we're combining it with that and coming up with recommendations.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll pass it back over to you, Ralph.
All right, so you've decided that you want and need a specialized assessment. So the first thing you're going to have to do is make a referral. And this is an important part. I know sometimes you've got a lot of files and people on your desks, and at times it's like, okay, we need to get an assessment. Let's get you started. We'll get some information, make some decisions based on what comes back to us. Away we go. I know, and I can speak for both Brenda and Andre and all the clients that I work with. The more specific you are in trying to determine what's the best assessment for the client and then providing information to us, the more specific are going to be your responses, and likely the more helpful those next steps, recommendations are going to be. So you may have a lot of experience with this and have no trouble organizing a specialized assessment for your clients, or you may be brand new starting out and you don't want to make a mistake because these are all really expensive. So if you're not sure, ask. You can phone Brenda, you can phone Andre, you can phone myself, or you can phone service providers in your neighborhoods and ask the differences, relay some of the client profile of the situation you're trying to deal with the clinician, and say, you know, I'm thinking this, but have you got ideas, or is there a different way to look at this. I think, and I've certainly found the individuals I've spoken to who have asked these types of questions find it very helpful, and they're not phoning often. In other words, they're learning quite quickly about these assessments as they're using them, and then they're able to make autonomous decisions quite soon. In terms of us as clinicians understanding what needs to be done, it's helpful to understand a synopsis of the individual, their potential barriers, their limitations, why they've come to seek your services. If there are medical reports, that's certainly helpful for us to understand the scope of any impairment. It also will be important to determine safety and whether or not a particular assessment, more so than likely the functional capacity testing, whether it should go ahead. So we do find those useful, and if you have them, you can quickly, I think, fax them. I think that's what BC does. No faxing? Okay, it's not faxing. Right? Obviously, I'm not getting the inside of this, but you're sending them probably through some portal then, and getting them to us, and we may even have some questions, so don't be surprised if a clinician reads some of this and might have a phone call to you. Okay. Really important you clarify your questions. You may be very used to particular service providers and you think that we can read your minds, and often we can, but sometimes we can't. And I can tell you a specific question will always be specifically answered. A general one may or may not have specifics in it, and it may not provide you with as much oomph in terms of where you're looking to go next with this client. We'd like you to find that these assessments are particularly helpful for you, but that requires you to be quite specific with us. I can tell you my Gettysburg address to my client or to my customers as well as to our clinician group is, if you can have a conversation, 5 minutes speaking with an evaluator or assessor can make or break the utility of that assessment. It often only takes that amount of time for us to get a good synopsis of what needs to be assessed and what particular directions we might need to make on the time. So it's invaluable. All right, and then off to Andre.
Thanks very much. So the next area we're going to be talking about is preparing the client for participating in this assessment process. Now, it may come as a surprise to some of us that not every client is chomping at the bit to undergo an assessment. And often there's some work that needs to be done up front to really help clients understand why this would be helpful to them and what it all involves. So there's a list of different things that are helpful, and I'll go through them one at a time. First one is to explain the purpose and benefits of the assessment to the client. I think clients are not alone in really kind of having a hard time when we don't know what is waiting for us. And so the more we know, the better we understand what exactly to expect, the more likely it is that we will be feeling comfortable with participating in any kind of activity that's been recommended to us. So first step along that road is to help a client understand how participating in this kind of activity is going to be of benefit to them. So a potential kind of a statement that might be helpful for a client is to say to them the purpose of this assessment is to help identify the best work pathway for you. And how would we go about doing that? What kind of things can we find out that may be getting in your way or may be causing you problems in coping with important things that need to be done as far as finding the right job or returning to employment? The other part of it is looking at the profile of strengths and weaknesses. And we can say to a client, everyone has strengths and weaknesses, things that they're good at, things that they're not good at. Let's try and find out what yours are. The information that we would get from an assessment like that, again, can be used to make recommendations to maximize potential. And we want to find out what is a good match for you. And also, every bit as important, what is not a good match? What kind of situation may be something that you're interested in doing but may not be as likely to lead to success? So what we want to try and find out is how can we address any barriers that exist, or how can we find ways around those barriers. I like to use metaphors when talking to clients, because often that makes things a little bit more clear to them. And when talking about these barriers, what I might say to people is, imagine you're walking into a room that's in the dark, and there's a whole bunch of furniture in that room, but because it's dark, you can't see the furniture. But if we had to switch the light on, you'll be able to see the furniture and find your way around that. And barriers are very much like that. If we don't know where they are, we keep on bumping into them and we don't progress. And yet if we can switch on the light and see where the barriers are, we can find ways around those barriers very easily. This doesn't mean the barriers suddenly go away or they're not there, but it allows us to get around them and get to where we want to go. Other important aspects here is that particular jobs, tasks, or work environments may be a really good fit for a client once we understand what the strengths and weaknesses are, and other environments may very well be as attractive but really not be as workable, based both on the strengths and weaknesses, but also on what the client wants and what his preferences for a client. Clearly what we're trying to achieve is to develop a clear, manageable plan that is going to help the client succeed in their vocational goals. The next really important part is to explain the rationale for the assessment. So again, a client may understand that there may be some benefits from doing an assessment, but why do they need an assessment themselves? So again, helping a client understand why, because of their particular history, their particular presentation, the needs and barriers and challenges that the particular client identified or presents with, is helpful to really kind of summarize that for him. Again, some ways of maybe explaining that to a client is helping them understand that you've described some pretty significant emotional or physical challenges that I think we're going to have to carefully consider before we can figure out what an important best employment goal is going to be for you. Or equally, I want to make sure exactly what steps we should take so that we can make sure that we protect your mental or physical health in terms of moving you towards employment. Understanding that there may be some challenges along the way, and the better prepared a person is and the better they understand what this whole process will look like, the more likely it is that they will be able to overcome these barriers to move forward towards employment, and particularly, as Brenda said earlier, sustainable employment. If we don't find the right kind of job, it's going to be that much harder for a person to not only make the transition, but to maintain functioning in this employment that's been identified for them. Other issues that we might want to highlight is the training program that you have selected requires a significant commitment in terms of time, effort on your part, money that needs to be committed. We want to be sure that this is a good choice for you, that you can manage it. Highlighting information that we have about a client, such as when we look at your job history, it's pretty clear you've had a hard time finding something that's a good match for you. This type of assessment is going to help figure out what it is that might work better for you. Or you've had lots of problems in school, you've had problems at work. I think this assessment is going to help us clarify what is going on. Some people have challenges with learning, and performing certain tasks at school and at work may be very difficult. Understanding this is going to help us find a way to make you successful. Final one, you've got a very specific goal in mind, but I'm concerned about the demands of this job and whether it's a good match for you. I'd like to get an opinion for this. Now, this is something that, as an employment professional, may be fairly familiar to you. The client has a very specific idea, and your spidey sense is saying, I'm not sure this is going to be exactly what is going to be needed. But you don't necessarily want to interfere or contaminate your working relationship and your rapport with the client. So here it's helpful to maybe kind of get another opinion, step outside of that relationship and say, let's get something objective, something that helps us understand exactly what is going to be involved in trying to get to this particular goal. And of course, this explanation can be followed up by explaining that the outcome may be yes, it may be no, but regardless of whether the assessment says yes, you can do this, this is appropriate, or no, it is not, it will also give us some steps that might be able to be followed in order to prepare for this kind of job if right now at this particular time this is not a suitable opportunity for you, a suitable goal for you, or it may suggest some alternatives that are possibly things you haven't thought about, but maybe looking at similar interests that you have, but maybe a better match for what it is that you need. Next one is, and this is what I referred to earlier, in terms of making the unknown known. The more a client knows what to expect, the easier it is for a client to be able to move forward. So demystifying what this assessment is going to look like, because people may have preconceived ideas. They may have experiences from the past that may not have been positive, and so that's in their heads. The idea of assessment for a lot of people involves tests, and people may not have had positive experiences with testing in the past, especially if they come with a long history of difficulties in the educational setting. So again, explaining and understanding exactly what this experience will look like can be very valuable. So helping the person understand that there's different parts to the assessment. The very first step typically is going to be an interview, a discussion with the psychologist or the occupational therapist that's going to be doing the assessment, and that this interview is going to involve all kinds of questions, but the questions are really intended to get an idea of who you as a client are, what kind of challenges you face and have faced in the past, what your strengths are, what you like as a person, because that is clearly a really important part of trying to understand what needs to be done to help you achieve the goals that you've set for yourself. Talking about the testing, help people understand that these are tests that are intended to figure out what kind of things you're good at, what kind of things are more challenging for you, where your strengths are, where the barriers are, and not tests that are designed to really kind of trip you up or just make you feel like you are not succeeding or inadequate, as may have been the case in the past in other kind of settings. The next component of the assessment, of course, is the report, and again, the report is an important part that is going to provide useful information and useful tools for this whole process, because it's going to recommend or provide recommendations for how to address these barriers that may be identified as part of the assessment process. And of course, it's going to make recommendations for jobs or training programs that may be a good match for you. And the final step of the process is a feedback or a debrief session. And again, clients may be, have had previous experiences where it's not clear to them that all the time and effort that they're putting into this whole process is going to lead to them understanding what that was all about, what the meaning is of the different findings and results, and where that's going to lead for them. So again, helping them understand that at the end of this process is going to be a meeting, the case manager or other employment professional, the client and the clinician will get together, and there'll be an opportunity to talk about the results, to ask any questions they might have, clarify anything they don't understand, and to really kind of talk about the recommendations that might be arising from the assessment. I'll hand over to Rolf for the next part.
All right, so we're talk a little bit about anxiety. You saw both Brenda and Andre's pictures at the beginning. I would be anxious if I came to see them. Large teeth, spiky hair, analytical stares staring right through. Your clients are going to be anxious. We talked a little bit about loss of confidence, dealing with disability, dealing with the stresses of not having financial security at the time that these clients are coming to you. So they are going to be anxious. And as Andre has illuminated, they're going to go through testing processes, and I certainly would feel anxious going through some of these tests myself. Or if you're dealing with chronic pain and you're being asked to go do a functional capacity evaluation, you're worried about, how much is this going to hurt? Is it going to set me back for weeks? Things like that. So people have very real emotions around these types of assessments. We certainly find there are a percentage of individuals that won't show up for their assessments, and often that can be related to the fact that they're anxious and overwhelmed by the process. It's sometimes difficult to reschedule these people, so we're trying as a team to get everybody on the same boat and organize to help these individuals along their way. And one of those ways is to acknowledge this, that there might be some anxiety, and that's a normal thing for them to be feeling. So you don't want to wait for the aftermath that, they didn't show up for their assessment, and then be figuring out why. Everybody's already starting to lose confidence. You want to assume that they may or may not have some difficulty about even gathering themselves together to attend the assessment, and talk about that with the clients. I think everybody benefits from those types of communications, and you would likely going to help them make it a successful process as a result. One of the things that you can do, I just hit that too many times. Thank you. No, I want to go one more slide. One of the things that you can do is speak about your experience as a case manager in understanding these assessments. You can speak about how clients have come back after these assessments and how they've felt about them, and outline some of the successes that you've had. I think that's probably normal for you to do, but I think it's worth mentioning here because that does normalize the process, and people can then see the backside of the assessment and that there are some useful things for them, and it'll help them manage that better. It's definitely a process of discovery for these clients. I think you need to focus on that discovery being something that can assist them and be successful. That they're actually, most clients at the end of the day have actually surprisingly enjoyed the process. They like the clinicians. They like the fact that they found some things that they could do effectively, and they felt far less anxious at the end of the assessment than they ever did at the beginning. And if you, again, speak about these things with the clients, I think it helps them prepare and see the purpose and the ability to attend. All right, so pass over to Brenda.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now are some of the client concerns that we've heard about. Now, certainly some of these are things that the psychologists or the occupational therapists hear directly from the clients who show up for these assessments, but some of these are also fed back to us from the employment professionals, the concerns that come up on their end from the clients. So we've picked a few here to highlight that seem to be the most common. So one concern that often comes up that the clients have expressed is if I go to one of these assessments and they give me this list of jobs that would be good matches for me, what if I don't like any of those jobs? What if I don't want to do any of those? And this seems to be based in a misunderstanding that this is a forced choice situation where they're going to be given a list of jobs and they have to pick something off that list. So I think it's important to dispel that myth right away. So the jobs, there will be specific jobs listed in the reports, but they are suggestions. It doesn't necessarily mean that what the client chooses to do will be included in that list. And often clients can identify some good options in that list that they see as attractive right from the get-go. But other times, the suggestions made by the clinician really are just serving as a starting point. So they help get ideas flowing, they get the conversation started between the client and the employment professional about what might be good or not good. Even having ideas that the client thinks, I don't think those are a great match for me, that itself gets the conversation going, looking at why, what would be better. It's also important to keep in mind that the report will contain more general recommendations about what kinds of work environments and job tasks are good or not so good matches for that client. So that information can be applied to any job under consideration. So if a job idea comes up either from the employment professional or from the client, the information in the report should help the team determine whether this would be an appropriate choice for the client or not. Another concern that's very common is clients worrying about being labeled. Some of them have a long history of feeling like they've been labeled throughout school and throughout their life in general, and they're worried there's just going to be more of it here. I think that we all stand by the philosophy that we don't want to label clients unnecessarily. We do sometimes provide diagnoses, so those are sometimes in the reports, but we only do this if there is a solid reason for doing so. So, for example, if a diagnosis is required to access a certain program or a type of funding or support, we'll make the diagnosis. Or if we're thinking about making a diagnosis, we'll just always be thinking about, what would be the potential benefits, the potential risks to the client if we actually make this formal diagnosis and put it on paper. Is it going to hurt the client or is it going to help the client? We do not want to put up unnecessary barriers. Our job is to make the process easier, not harder. I don't want to see a psychologist, or I don't need to see a psychologist. So I think here, I understand. This isn't counseling though, and I think that's often the fear. Clients are afraid they're being sent for counseling, or they're going to be psychoanalyzed, or the psychologist is going to be able to read their mind, all those kinds of stereotypes about this. I think it's important to be clear that the psychologist that they're going to see is working in a very specific vocational context. These are people who are trained to help clients who are facing barriers to employment find the best way to overcome these barriers. There is no element of counseling involved in these assessments. I don't have any mental health problems. Why should I have an assessment? This kind of point often comes up with clients who maybe don't have a mental health problem per se. Their challenge is more with a learning or intellectual challenge, but it also may be clients who their issues are more personality based or interpersonally based. So they really have a history of having difficulty getting along with people or functioning well in situations where they're being closely supervised or working well with coworkers. And they perhaps don't see it as a mental health problem. So how do you explain to somebody like that why they should have an assessment? So some examples of things you could say. If you have experienced difficulties finding or keeping work, it could be helpful to explore the reasons for this. These assessments are designed to identify career options that are best suited to your profile of strengths and weaknesses. So here we're talking again about, we're looking at what your strengths and weaknesses are. It isn't necessarily mental health. It might be, they're all different ways that somebody can have strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes the trouble that people are having is due to other factors, such as learning challenges, acquired brain dysfunction, so for example, after a head injury, physical injuries or problems, or sometimes their life situation. If you face any kind of barrier, it's worth trying to figure out how to get around it. I hate tests. So Andre has spoken to this already. Of course, this is normal. And in the psychological assessments, they do include academic tests, and those are a lot like school. That's true. But one thing that you can reassure clients is they do not need to study. So we just want to see in these assessments what level they're at right now. It isn't, there's no reason that they have to excel. There's not going to be a letter grade system here. We just want to know what level they're at, because that will help determine the answer to questions about certain jobs and also about training programs. Some clients are also reassured by the fact that all the tests are short. So we're not going to torture anybody by making them continue on a test for a long time if they're struggling. They don't stay on any task for very long, so time tends to pass very quickly. Another very reassuring thing for a lot of clients is that a lot of the testing is not like school at all. Certainly that's true in the physical or functional tests that are done by the occupational therapist, but even with the psychological testing, a lot of the tests are like puzzles or challenges. And many people are actually very surprised to find that they enjoy these tasks. The other thing that I think is important to reassure clients is because they see that they're going for these long assessments, they're 6 to 8 hours long, some of them, that they'll get breaks. So they're not going to have to sit there and do the assessment all day. They will be given breaks, and they will be told they can ask for a break when they need one. This is related to this, so I don't think I can handle a whole day. So again, you can reassure about the breaks. But I think it's also helpful to let clients know that if they're struggling, if they're having trouble making it through the day, to just let the clinician know. We can always have them come back on another day to finish up if they can't do the full day. Another point, just back to that previous slide, is if you, as the employment professional, don't think the client can make it through the whole day, you can let usually your provider know that at the point of assessment, and they can just start off by scheduling the assessment over 2 days instead of 1. Okay, so then the last thing here is providing a client handout. Now, I don't know if every employment or every provider that does specialized assessments does this. We do, and I'm certain it's something you could ask other providers to do. But we have a document, one for each of our services, which is essentially preparing the client. So sometimes these are framed like frequently asked questions that help to, like we talked about before, sort of demystify the process and reassure them about some of their concerns. But in general, we make these accessible to the employment professionals we work with. So if they're talking with a client and suggesting that maybe this assessment might be appropriate, they can just give the client one of these to take home and to review and consider. When we book an assessment with a client, we also make sure that this is sent to them so that they can refer to it, they've got the information before they show up to their assessment. So hopefully this helps make them feel like a little bit more prepared, a little bit more like they know what to expect. Okay, we move on and talk about the feedback session.
So certainly our experience as clinicians, and I'm sure that this is what we've heard from many employment professionals as well, is that in many ways the feedback session, after all the work that's been done along the way, is the one opportunity that I think is a really crucial part of this whole process. And then for many clients, this is the part they remember best, particularly when they've had a good experience with this whole assessment process. And so really this is an important meeting to kind of prepare for as best as we can. And some of the ideas that we've kind of spelled out here in terms of how best to make the most of the feedback session include being, as an employment professional yourself, being kind of well aware of the kinds of things that you want to get out of that session. So often reading the report beforehand is really helpful. We certainly all are busy, and I think it's often the case that people assume that the assessor, the clinician, is going to be the one who's going to do most of the talking and provide the feedback. But having a good sense of what is being presented is helpful, because that also allows you as an employment professional to start giving some thought to what you would like the client to take home from that session. So it gives you a chance maybe to prepare some questions that you'd like to put on the table during the assessment, during the feedback session, things that you want to highlight, kind of a take-home message that you want the client to really be clear about. Also, potentially, there may be some problems that you think might arise once you've read the report. There may be some kind of red flags that may come up that might be kind of raised during that discussion, and so being aware of that, preparing for that, potentially even if you have some concerns, talking to the clinician about that before the time, and saying, look, this is something that you may not be aware of, or may not have kind of considered in terms of this particular recommendation, but how should we deal with this if this comes up in the assessment? So that kind of preparation can be really helpful in terms of getting absolutely the most benefit from the feedback session. Another way in which really kind of good results can be obtained is for you as well to participate in this whole process. So again, we assume this is the clinician show. They are going to be doing the talking. They're going to have the center stage, but that really does not need to be the case. And in fact, that's probably not the best way for that process to go. People tend to respond better when there's some interaction, when there's some back and forth. And so, again, as the employment professional, you may be able to get that ball rolling by asking some questions, because often what that does is it kind of models to the client that it's okay to ask questions. clients often will feel a little bit like, you know, they sort of just there to listen and may not have the confidence to actually step in and try and clarify things that may not be clear to them in the feedback process. You may also be able to emphasize what you think is useful or provide positive feedback to the client as we go through it to kind of help them identify things that you've observed yourself in your dealings with them that is really kind of highlighted by the results of the assessment. Very much encouraging client participation is helpful. Asking open-ended questions, for example, sometimes even commenting on body language, kind of saying, look, you know, when the clinician spoke about this, I saw that you really kind of took notice of that and it seemed to be meaningful to you. That kind of matches my own experience of what we've been talking about in the past. Or when it looks like something was unexpected for a client, again, you know, commenting on that, it looks like that was a bit of a surprise for you. Do you want to have a little bit more information about that? Would you like the clinician to expand on this particular issue? And then at the end of the feedback session, again, wrapping up, making the most of it, very much helpful to ask the client for the client's overall reaction. What did this mean to you? Was this helpful? Did this make some sense? Does it kind of match what your day-to-day reality is like? Also very important to help the client understand that we all recognize that this is a lot of information in one very short section to absorb, and make it very clear to the client that it's a good idea to take some time to think it over. Give the client a copy of the report, take home, and encourage them to read through it, come up with any questions that they might have, schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss this. And what, as clinicians, we will often at that point also make really clear to the client is if there's something else that's coming up once they've read through the report, that between the two of you as the employment professional and the client, you're not able to address, there's always the opportunity to speak to the clinician again and get some clarification on some issues, or just really sort of tie together some pieces to make the most benefit for the client. All right, next section, making the most of the report and the recommendations. Brenda.
Yeah, okay, so here we'll try to provide some pointers on how to make the most of the information you get in the report, particularly the recommendations. But I'll preface this by noting that we recognize that as employment professionals, probably a lot of you have a lot of additional ideas for strategies on how to take this information and leverage it in terms of moving the client forward. But what we have here are some ideas from our perspective about how to help move clients forward in a positive direction. So there's going to be a lot of information in the report, and the report will clarify both strengths and weaknesses. So it is important to underline and discuss the client's strengths, of course. These are important as it is certainly advantageous to capitalize on these, and it can also be very motivating for the client to see where their strengths lie. But it is also very important to acknowledge and recognize the barriers. And I really like Andre's metaphor that he used earlier about sort of lighting up the room and illuminating where the barriers are. So having an open, frank discussion about the barriers, I think, is essential. So they're on the table. And then it's establishing what the plan is to get around the barriers. So talking specifically about what the client needs to do. Now, what you may notice in the recommendations is that there are a lot of recommendations, and sometimes it's helpful to sort of shortlist them. So what are the things that the client really has to do? What is the primary focus that you are going to work on together? And what kinds of things should the client be doing, but aren't necessarily in the have-to list? So it's a little bit of a prioritization. Another thing that's useful is talk about how the strategies that are recommended can be applied, because the report will talk about some planning recommendations, but also some things the clients can be doing themselves to get around the barriers. And there are probably some things on that list that the client can start doing immediately to help them prepare for employment, things they can be doing in their everyday life. So getting them started with those sorts of things right away. Okay, there we go. Goal setting, of course, is important. For many clients, what will happen is that there will be a long-term goal, but it is not immediately accessible. So there's going to have to be some short-term goals that lead the client in the right direction. I'm sure many of you are familiar with SMART goals. That acronym stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound goals. Using this kind of strategy when you're goal setting makes it a lot easier for clients to achieve their goals and also be able to recognize that they actually have achieved them. So using this in the goal setting procedure, I think, is a really great idea. When you're looking at the short-term goals, I think that it's quite useful to talk about how the short-term goals are leading to the long-term goal, so connecting them. For some clients, having a long-term goal is very motivating. So they know what they're working towards and they're willing to engage in the steps that they need to get there. But for other clients, having a long-term goal that looks too far away can be very overwhelming. So it looks unachievable. For those people, the goals are useful because it helps them sort of see that ladder that they can take to get there. Something that I've realized more and more as I've talked to employment professionals is the importance of making the short-term goals meaningful. So a couple of examples of this. I've talked to some case managers in particular that have talked about setting short-term goals for clients who are not ready yet for paid employment. And so they're looking at volunteer options as a first step. And some of the success that they've had is talking to clients about how the volunteer position is connected to that long-term goal. So for example, finding a volunteer position that is in an area or a field that is consistent with where they want to be for their end goal. So they see it as gaining experience that is relevant to their end goal. Another way that they've made that volunteer experience meaningful to the client is they've said, look, one of the problems you have right now is you have a big hole in your resume. So having a volunteer position is one way to fill that hole, and it's also a way to get a reference. So if you perform well in this volunteer position, then you may be able to get a reference that's going to help you in terms of accessing that longer-term goal down the road. Okay, so I know we're running short on time, so I'm not going to speak too much more about this. I'll just move on to sum it up here. The goal of all of our assessments is to make them as useful as possible to both the client and the employment professional. We want to answer questions related to physical, psychological, and cognitive functioning, vocational skills and interests, of course, and suitable work and training options. And we want to make specific, practical, and individualized recommendations that maximize the chances of successful and durable employment. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Brenda, Andre, and Ralph. So I think what we'll do now is we haven't had a lot of questions come in during that second section. And in the interest of time, we'll move straight ahead into the two case studies. But before we do that, I'll have my colleague Susanna introduce our two presenters. And I do want to encourage everyone to continue to send in their questions. We hope that we can get to a few more before we end today.
Right. Thank you very much to our clinicians. I really appreciate highlighting the view of the assessments from the client's perspective. I think that was really valuable. Thank you. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce our next two presenters for the case studies in this session of the webinar. You might recognize them as presenters of the Customized Employment webinar that was hosted by the Center last fall. We have here with us at the Center, Christine Buchanan, the Director of Performance Management and Quality Assurance at Open Door Group. And also presenting is Alejandra Dominguez, who is in Nanaimo. She's a Manager of Customized Employment and Job Development at VIVRS, Vancouver Island Vocational Rehabilitation Services. We're going to start off with Christine.
Thank you. I'm Christine from Open Door Group, and I'm going to do a case study on Amelia. So Amelia first came to Work BC, and she was working the Options Work BC that's out in Wally, and working with one of our vocational counselors, Samar Sandhu, who is working in that location. So Amelia is 25 years old. She's a single person. She doesn't have dependents. She is on employment insurance. She's employment obligated. for 5 years. And she's also living in the basement of her mother's house, who is also on BCA employment insurance, income assistance. The highest schooling that she received was grade 7. She started grade 8 and dropped out. Throughout her whole years in elementary school, she didn't receive any supports academically, or no assessments were done on her abilities in schooling. She had one paid position where she was selling cutlery for less than a year. It was not in a store, it was going around to family and friends and selling, and that wasn't very effective, so she dropped that position. She's volunteering at a theater company and really hopes to stay doing that continuously even as she moves forward. Her history, the diagnosis was a focal seizure disorder, and she's been taking medication. Her last seizure that she had was when she was 10 years old, so that was 15 years ago. Okay, I'm just going to drop that other slide. So Amelia met with the vocational counselor, Samar Sandhu, and she was doing the disability-related employment needs assessment. During that, it was determined that further information was needed to be able to assist her in her employment goals. So we first started looking at a vocational psychological learning assessment. And from that, going through, it was determined, I'm pausing for a sec, sorry, one sec. I want to go back. Thank you. No, forward. There. And then from the vocational assessment, Back in Motion determined that there were some fundamental difficulties associated with her visual processing. So we were going to add on an additional assessment. The Back in Motion contacted Samar, a consent was signed to move up to a neurological psychological assessment, and that was completed with Amelia. After the assessment was done, as they were talking about throughout the whole session, the feedback session with Dr. Regamble and Dr. Bellion happened, and the results from the vocational assessment see significant impairment with visual spatial processing, visual memory, information processing speed, working memory, which could be influenced by medication or primarily due with the seizure disorder. So in this assessment, there was a diagnosis of a mild neurocognitive disorder associated with her seizure disorder. In the recommendations or in the assessment was showing some barriers to address. So the employability skills, the lack of certification, lack of labor market attachment, she's got a grade 7, financial hardship, and also very socially isolated, low self-esteem, self-worth, confidence. I've already mentioned the diagnosis that came from there, and then talking about the difficulties with learning, reading, writing, spatial processing. The areas that came out as vocational recommendations were plant or animal care, say pet grooming, landscaper, floral design, arts and crafts, and food services. So the results from this, Amelia and Samar went away and they started to do their employment search. So they contacted many companies within employment care, pet grooming, pet stores, and some required certification, or it was that she couldn't do all the tasks that were required for the particular position. Landscaping, they were contacted. She could do those types of work, however, it was seasonal and wouldn't match for sustainable employment. So it was looking at, do we look at customized employment where we carve the positions out, or can we look at skills training? Could she take a short-term training, get some certification to assist her? So Samar contacted, again, Dr. Bellion and explained to him, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at possibly going into building service workers, so doing cleaning, housekeeping, and what did he think about that? And then what did he also think that she would be good at doing short skills training? Is there any types of accommodations in there? So Dr. Bellion responded and said yes, that it would be good, and then he did an amendment to the assessment saying if she's going into training, these are the types of accommodations and supports that she will need. Extra time for tests, writing tests in a quiet room. If there's math involved, working with calculator or formula sheet, having a model available. having a peer or tutor look over some of her work, getting permission to record the lectures, so with the memory, being able to catch up on any missing information. Assistive technology may be an assistant, such as a computer or speech-to-text speech recognition or text-to-voice software. So that was taken, and then also looking at what are cognitive strengths that bring to going to school and also in employment. So she's got strong, broad verbal abilities. She's got relative strength in verbal memory. Once she fully understands what is involved, she can remember that. And then also her executive functioning that Andre was talking about, that's key, she's very strong in. So planning, organizing, reasoning, mental flexibility. So these do not require visual spatial processing. So this information was taken and away they went and did information interviews, kind of talking to employers in the building service worker industry on what types of places can do training, and then researching schools. So it came out that Vocational Community College had a full-time 8-week program, and they also provided experience, hands-on experience in the industry. Other schools also did the building service worker program. This one was chosen for 2 reasons. One was the level of depth of disability resources and supports that it provided, and also for Amelia, it was really a great confidence booster to be in a place like Vancouver Community College when she has a grade 7 education. This was a really big deal for her. So she started the training. All of the recommendations that Dr. Vaillant brought in, they were added in. She starts the program. She got food supports and clothing to complete, and she completed it. The highest achievement that Amelia felt for the program itself was that after the program started, she was able to go. She didn't need, any extra supports from the Disability Center. The staff spoke very highly of her, that she did very well, and she did very well in her practicum. So once the training was done, it was back to the vocational counselor and to find employment. So the areas that they looked at, 7 in janitorial services were contacted, 2 wanted an interview, and Service Master was the one that offered the position. I added this piece in because I thought it was so good, because they first said 20 hours a week at $10.25 an hour, and Samara went back and said that's not suitable, she needs full-time, she's on income assistance, she won't be on income assistance anymore, and so they increased it to 5 days a week and $11 an hour. So with that, they also, for the job accommodations for Amelia, taking in all of the recommendations from the assessment and the amendment that was given, giving a 6-week training period, so much longer than normal, job coaching, and then providing that job maintenance and retention services to assist her in maintaining the job. So the employer feedback, she's now, I'm just trying to calculate, it's probably close to the 10 to 12 week where she has kept the job with the employer. So both of them are very happy. So that's it for my part of the case study, and I just want to thank you, and hopefully that you can see the benefits of what a specialized assessment does in assisting people reach their goals. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christine. So we're just handing the screen over to Alejandra in Nanaimo. There we go. We can see your screen, Alejandra. So I'm just going to unmute you. And all right, the mic is yours.
Hey. Thank you very much, Greg, and everybody in the center for the opportunity to allowing us to using this platform again. We also really appreciate the opportunity with collaborating with Open Door Group and Back in Motion in this project. So I hope you guys are not too tired to my intervention. Today I'm going to share a little bit about our experience in Vancouver Island Vocational and Rehabilitation Services in using specialized assessments, as well as I will present a case study. At Vivers, the use of specialized assessments is a very common practice. We often refer our clients to these assessments, and we also rely on clients' previous assessments to make case management decisions. Referrals can occur at different stages of the case management process. For example, when a new client comes to us, their first meeting will be with an intake worker who will make a conscious effort in determining the need for further assessment before referring to other employment services. Having said that, it is not always possible for the intake worker to do the referral at that point. So then it is the case manager role to determine the need for further assessment down the road. So once we have decided to refer a client for an assessment, we use different strategies to prepare them. So it was reassuring to hear our clinicians talking this morning, because we use many of the techniques that they already mentioned. So I'm just going to go very quickly through the ones we use. I have to say that most of the clients that we refer to specialized assessment are receptive to the referral, as long as it is properly introduced to them. One strategy that we use is to frame it as an opportunity to learn more about themselves and to help them to identify additional supports that they will be needing for employment in the future. Preparing the client for the assessment requires that we explain the whole process, and it was mentioned before in the presentation, including the timeline and also what will happen in the actual day of the assessment. So, for example, one of the things that we have done in the past, and it was mentioned here as well, was that some of our clients may identify that one long day of assessment is too hard for them. So there's the possibility to negotiate or arrange with our assessor that they will break down the session into or even more days if necessary. So in other cases, based on our clientele, meeting the assessor before the assessment could also help to ease the anxiety for those clients that aren't very sure about the process. And finally, the case manager has an important role in obtaining collateral information that needs to be collected during the assessment. So it is the case manager role to assist the client in beginning to dig this information that will very likely be needed to formulate any diagnosis after the assessment. So the case study that I'm presenting today, it's about Bernard, who is one of our clients. He's a male client who came with us when he was on his late 30s, and he experienced some physical challenges, including difficulty to walk, overweight, back issues, and chronic pain. Bernard had lived in transitional house when we met him after 2 years of being homeless, and in spite of reporting that he was very close to his family, he comes from an Aboriginal family, and but he never wanted to become a burden for them, so he became homeless for a few months. Bernard's only work experience had been very sporadic, and he used to work for a family friend as a prep cook, and he accessed mainstream case management services for almost a year before being referred to us. And he also was on income assistance at the time of the referral. The services that we delivered to Bernard were the following. When the Beaver specialist started meeting with Bernard, she uncovered that he had been exposed to violence and abuse as a child. In addition, he was suffering from the grief of recently losing a sibling that he was very close to. As a result, Bernard was referred to personal counseling. So that would be the first service that he got from us. Counseling immediately proved to be an excellent support to Bernard, who normally was very pleasant but extremely timid person. So Beaver specialists had actually had difficulty establishing conversation in the first few appointments, so some problems with communications, because he will, when we asked him questions, he would just answer yes or no, so we weren't really sure about many things in the beginning. But as time progressed and rapport was developed, the Beaver specialist started suspecting possible cognitive deficiencies based on traumatic injury that he reported having as a child. So at this point, Beaver specialist became also interested in further assessing Bernard's, and also she wanted to assess Bernard's levels of intellect, as he had never been assessed in the past. So at this point, he was referred to a neuropsychological assessment at Campbell and Fairweather Psychology Group, which is our service provider that we normally collaborate with in Nanaimo. And his assessment results confirmed that he had suffered from brain injury. So he had an acquired brain injury dysfunction. And he was also experiencing low cognitive abilities and challenges with short-term memory. Bernard was especially triggered by noise, and therefore he tended to isolate himself from others. But the key thing about Bernard's assessment was that he was able to use this information to apply and successfully obtain his PWD status, Persons with Disabilities designation. After the assessment, Beaver specialists provided customized employment services to Bernard. During the discovery assessment, the specialist uncovered that he was a very talented carver. So the picture that you are seeing on the screen is one of his pieces. During the home visit, the specialist was able to observe different pieces of his, and at that time he also told us that he had obtained a contract to carve a pole for a local organization in the Cauchan area. So just wanted to make a few notes on Bernard's assessment. As you can tell from the story, like in this case, the referral didn't occur right at the beginning. It took a while before the case manager could refer Bernard to the assessment. First of all, because he wasn't very unsure about the process. And also another barrier was that he used to live in a rural area between the Cauchan Valley and Nanaimo. He used to attend meetings at our office close to Cauchan, but unfortunately the assessment site is in Nanaimo, so we had to provide him with extra support to make this happen. So one of the things that we did, as we normally do, we pay for transportation, but we also arranged that one of our case managers would pick up Bernard, who was coming by bus, and then she took him to the specialized assessment site. We make sure that he had some food with him for the whole day, and also she picked him up after that and took him back to the bus station. And another thing that we did, because we didn't want to make him go again to the assessment site for the debriefing session, so we arranged with the assessor that the debriefing occurred through Skype. So that's one of the things that we did to make the debriefing session happen. And finally, obtaining collateral information through a family member, in this case his grandmother, was crucial for the assessment results. In the end, Bernard transitioned into self-employment within the customized employment services. And as a result, his specialist supported him in creating a business idea that provided him with the possibility to use his more artistic and creative nature, as well as giving him the flexibility to work at his own pace to accommodate his physical limitations. Bernard is now able to supplement his PWD income, as well as having a job that he really loves. And he's now working on building his own website and is thinking about association with a carving business in Vancouver. One last thing that I wanted to mention about Bernard's story is that he had now reconnected with his band, which at the beginning of the process when we met him, he didn't want to do, because probably because some bad memories that he had, from childhood. So then he shared with us that after participating in the specialized assessment, he changed his outlook, and he realized that there were services available to him that could significantly change his life. So now he's more open and confident about entering other services. So this is the end of our case study. I'll be happy to answer any questions, but for now I'll hand back the microphone to Greg.
Okay, thank you very much, Alejandra. We do have some more questions that we'd like to take at this time, so thanks to everyone for sending in your questions. We won't be able to get through them all, but I'll just take a sample of them, and then we'll see if it's possible to perhaps post some of the other questions and have answers to those on the blog post with the recording, hopefully later this week or early next week. So the first question that I'm going to pose to the group is around assessment costs. So there's obviously the question about payment and who pays for the cost, and there's different funding models and structures and programs. So I'm kind of combining a couple of questions here, but I'm wondering if maybe either the clinicians or perhaps Christina or Alejandra could talk a little bit about the costs of doing the assessments and how that works.
Well, the vast majority of the referrals for specialized assessments for us come from the employment service programs of BC, so the Work BC centers. So the costs of these assessments are covered by the government, essentially, so they do not come out of pocket for the client. But we do get some referrals privately as well, so people who are able to pay for these assessments themselves. But generally speaking, these are expensive assessments, and they are for the most part too expensive for clients to access on their own. So they need the support to do so. Yeah.
Okay. And there was, I think, Brenda, you mentioned how you, at Back in Motion, you provided some of these assessments in more rural areas. Mm-hmm. Someone's asking a question, I guess, more specifically about how exactly that works and how that would be possible in a community like, say, Fort St. John, for example, as she mentioned.
Yeah. So it's a lot easier for the psychological and the neuropsychological assessments to happen remotely because our testing equipment can be easily packaged into a suitcase. But it's a little bit different for the functional capacity evaluations and the work simulation assessments, but I'll just pass it over to Ralph to take that question.
The short answer is with difficulty. We have done a roadshow before when Brenda and I were much younger, and we packaged up a lot of assessment equipment in a van and took it up island. And that worked out. We ended up in a hotel room or a hotel, and we rented out one of their rooms, ballroom type thing, and set up our equipment there and did some assessments. The functional capacity evaluation requires quite a bit of equipment. Some of it's heavy if we're looking at strength and capacity. It's going to be difficult. Before we would ever want to look at that, we'd also want to look at who in that sector might be able to do it before we would come up with that type of equipment. The work simulation may be easier to do. It all depends, again, on the specifics of that work simulation and what's being asked, the questions that we would need to answer. We may be able to package that up easier and have it there. Likely, if we're going to do this to that kind of area, we would need to package a few assessments together. To just do one would really not make a tremendous amount of sense.
Okay.
And depending on the program that you're in, if it is a program such as Work BC, there's travel costs in there. So it could be such that the client travels to, say, the Lower Mainland to get the assessment rather than the other way around. So then all the equipment is here and easier and that.
We definitely have, we can put clients up in hotels.
Yeah.
We have corporate,
just depends on the funding body.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I'll just throw out one more question before I turn it over to Susanna again. The question is around FASD. Can the neurovocational specialist confirm a diagnosis for an adult where no formal records are available?
This is a question we have heard many times, and I think a lot of people are struggling with exactly that kind of situation. The problem with making a diagnosis of a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is that there's a lot of different aspects to it. There's a need for very extensive collateral information about the mother's use of alcohol, exactly when it happened. There's a medical component to it that needs to be assessed. So in order to make that diagnosis, this is often not possible to do this when the client is an adult and there's no records available and there's nothing else that allows us to go through these steps. But that does not have to be the end of the road because it really does depend on what the purpose would be for having that diagnosis. It's not a diagnosis that in adulthood necessarily leads to very much in the way of additional services or funding. And often really the question is just, what is this client's profile of barriers and strengths? And this is certainly something that the neuropsychological vocational assessment can do. We can go so far as to also confirm that a client's profile, neuropsychological profile, is consistent with the typical profile with this type of diagnosis. So if there's some need to try and really kind of try and understand the origins or the sort of the type of difficulties that a person is likely to have, the assessment can help with that, but it cannot go as far as to confirm the diagnosis.
Okay, thank you, Andre.
Okay. That concludes the formal presentations, but before we wrap up, I would like to ask Anita Sharman, Manager of Diversity and Client Inclusion at the Ministry of Social Development and Social Innovation, to say a few words about BC Disability Employment Month. We want to add that the Ministry has been a supporter for this specialized assessments webinar and one of the leading facilitators in making it happen. Anita?
Thank you, Susanna. I just wanted to take a couple minutes as we wrap up today's webinar to talk about Disability Employment Month. As you're likely aware, September marks the second annual Disability Employment Month for British Columbians, and it's an opportunity for us to raise awareness about the skills and abilities that people with disabilities can bring to the workplace and encourage businesses in BC to build inclusive, diverse workforces. We know that many of our Work BC service providers are hosting events, and we will be sharing stories and information about these events throughout the month on workbc.ca. We encourage you to keep an eye out on that page and to find out some information and updates there. Events we've heard about so far for Disability Employment Month include open houses, information sessions. We also know that there are luncheons, teas, barbecues being held with specialized speakers and discussion time throughout the province, so that's very exciting for us to see. We also know that some Work BC locations are hosting inclusive employer awards and taking time to honor the community of employers who are supporting the work that we do in the employment services industry every single day. Again, the link is up there, workbc.ca, so scroll down to the very bottom of the page for the Disability Employment Month link. Also wanted to take a moment to talk about the next EPBC webinar. So this is quite specific to the EPBC service delivery community for those of you that are sector-based. This is for our EPBC contractors. For the last year, we have been holding monthly webinars to support capacity and competency building for our contractors and service providers. The next one is October 20th, and it is regarding immigrants and foreign credential recognition. For those of you that are looking to register as well as get your continuing education credit hours, the events and activity calendar link on the EPBC extranet will get you all of the information you need. And just a really quick thank you to the Diversity and Client Inclusion Working Group for the diligent efforts over the last year and this month in presenting these best practices sessions. And a big thank you to today's specialized assessors. We really appreciate Dr. Brenda Hogan, Ralph Cheeseman, Dr. Andre Villian, as well as Christine Buchanan and Alejandra Dominguez. We also know that Baron Grunhage, Cynthia Abbott, and Darcy Davidson provided quite a significant amount of background work to be able to facilitate this, and to Greg Lockwood and Susanna Gurr for working with the ministry and our contractors to coordinate and plan today's session. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Anita. And before we wrap up today, I just want to thank everyone on behalf of the center, our presenters especially for coming together and bringing this information and presentation together. I think most importantly, thanks to all of you out there for attending. We saw a huge a number of you register and tune in for the entire 2 hours today. We're really thrilled to see that. I do want to mention that the session was recorded, and we will post the video of the presentation on our website and send you all the link in an email within the next week. You may have noticed there in the last little bit of the presentation while Alejandra was presenting, I added some handouts to the panel, and this is something new with our webinar software. So I'm not sure if you're able to see those handouts, but there's some really good FAQs and sample reports that our clinicians provided us with. So you may be able to access them now, or if not, we're going to post them on that same link with the recording as well. You can see here our next webinar is scheduled for October 26th. We're going to welcome Annette Burrows and Self Advocates as our guest speakers on a presentation on best practices in supported employment, perspectives from the field of practice. So again, that's on the 26th. It's scheduled for 2 hours, and stay tuned to the center's website, cfeebc.org, for more information. Thank you again, and that ends our event today. So on behalf of my colleagues and presenters here at the center and in Nanaimo, thanks for participating in today's discussion, and have a great afternoon.